I gave everything to the owner of the house where I live. And the worst part is that it wasn't even out of desire. It was out of necessity, out of desperation from not being able to pay the rent. Each encounter was a bitter reminder of my sacrifice, a weight I carried in silence. If this sounds scandalous to you, wait until you hear how I got here, because everything in this story is as twisted as it seems, and the ending is something I never even imagined. I'm Luisa, I'm 33 years old, and I could describe myself as a woman who draws attention. My long, dark hair frames a face that, according to what I've been told, has something captivating about it. My body, with curves that seem to have been made for sin, has always been a source of both admiration and envy. However, neither my beauty nor my sensuality has saved me from the hardships of life. My husband Angel and I live in a small apartment in a humble neighborhood in the city. The walls are so thin you can hear the neighbors arguing, and the humidity seeps into the corners as if it wants to be part of our lives. It's the kind of place you don't choose, but end up in when you have no other options. The crisis hit us hard. A few months ago, Angel lost his job as a security guard, and while I was cleaning houses, my income barely covered food. The debts began to pile up, like a heap of dirty laundry you can't ignore, and the rent, as always, was the heaviest burden. We lived day by day, putting out fires while new ones ignited, and then there was Don Samuel, the building owner, a man you could barely look at without feeling a chill. He was an old, shabby man with a prominent belly that always seemed to escape his poorly buttoned shirt. His breath smelled like a mix of tobacco and cheap alcohol, and his eyes were those of a predator. When he came to collect the rent, his voice echoed through the hallways, filling the air with tension. No one wanted to have problems with him. It all started on a Monday. Angel was out looking for work, and I was trying to organize the bills on the kitchen table. Don Samuel showed up unexpectedly, knocking on the door with those sharp knocks that made the hinges tremble. "Mrs. Luisa, how are we doing with the rent this month?" he asked, his voice heavy with patience. "Don Samuel, I know we owe you 2 months already, but my husband is looking for work, and My voice broke. I had nothing else to offer. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I felt a knot in my stomach. "I can't wait any longer," he said. "You're good people, but I also have my own bills. Maybe we could come to an arrangement." The way he said it sent chills down my spine. At first, I didn't understand what he meant, but when his gaze scanned my body shamelessly, everything made sense. My legs trembled, and my cheeks burned. "Don Samuel, I don't know what you're talking about," I murmured, taking a step toward me. "You're a smart woman, don't play dumb. I'm just saying that if you help me relieve some of our tension, I could forget about the debt." I wanted to scream, to throw him out of my house, but his voice was a cruel reminder of the precarious situation we were living in. If he kicked us out, where would we go? My eyes filled with tears as I tried to think clearly. "Think about your husband," he continued, lowering his voice. "I'm sure he wouldn't want you to end up on the street." That night I couldn't sleep. The weight of his words suffocated me, mixing with guilt and fear. The moral dilemma consumed me. A part of me felt like I was betraying Angel just by considering Don Samuel's proposal. But another, more pragmatic and desperate part, couldn't stop thinking about the possible consequences of rejecting him. In the following days, I tried to avoid Don Samuel as much as possible. Whenever I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, I locked myself in the kitchen, pretending to be busy. But every time I saw his figure in the hallway, that disgusting smile, and that look that seemed to strip me bare, the internal conflict flared up again. Angel, for his part, kept looking for work. His tired eyes and forced smile broke my heart. One night, while we were having a meal of rice and beans, he took my hand and said, "We're going to get through this, Luisa. I promise you." I nodded, swallowing my tears. He had no idea of the storm I was going through inside. The rumors in the neighborhood didn't help either. I knew Don Samuel wasn't exactly a saint. There were stories from other women saying he had tried something similar with them. Some had fled, others had simply disappeared overnight. But were those stories true, or just hallway gossip? One afternoon, while washing clothes in the small shared courtyard, My neighbor Carmen approached with a strange smile. "How are things, Luisa? Did Don Samuel come to collect the rent yet?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and malice. "Angela and I are figuring out how to catch up soon," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. Carmen let out a bitter laugh. "Be careful, girl. That old man is always looking for something more than just money." Her words stayed with me for the rest of the day, feeding my fear and doubts. But they also made me wonder if I could really find a solution before it was too late. Time was running out, and with each passing day, I felt the abyss growing deeper. I knew that sooner or later I would have to face Don Samuel, but what would I do when that moment arrived? Would I be able to stand firm, or would I give in? Desperation. That was the question that kept me awake every night as the darkness of the apartment surrounded me, a reminder of our situation. That morning, the sun barely filtered through the worn curtains of the apartment. I had spent the night awake, tossing in bed and battling the tangled thoughts that suffocated me. The clock read 8:30 when I heard Don Samuel's heavy footsteps on the stairs. My heart began to race as if it wanted to leap out of my chest. I knew the meeting was inevitable. I got up slowly, trying to stay calm. Angel had already left early, hopeful for a job interview he had managed to secure. "Maybe this is the one," he had told me before leaving with a smile that tore me apart inside. I smiled back, hiding the hurricane of emotions that was coursing through me. The sharp knocks on the door echoed throughout the apartment. I approached with trembling steps and opened it. There he was, with his wrinkled shirt and that look that made me feel small and defenseless. "Good morning, Luisa," he greeted me with a smile that froze my blood. "May I come in?" I nodded silently, stepping aside to let him in. He walked to the small kitchen table and sat down as if he were in his own home. I stood still, crossing my arms to try to shield myself, even though his gaze had already scanned every inch of my body. "Luisa, I hope you've thought about our conversation the other day," he said in a tone that mixed patience and threat. "I don't want to be pushy, but time is running out, and I need to know if we're going to reach an agreement." I felt a lump in my throat. The words crowded my mind, but none of them managed to come out. Finally, I gathered enough courage to speak. "Don Samuel, I still don't know how to fix this. We are doing everything we can to come up with the money. My husband is looking for work, and My voice cracked, and my eyes filled with tears. He settled into the chair, folding his hands over his abdomen as he looked at me with an expression that was meant to be understanding, but only made me feel uncomfortable. "Look, Luisa, you don't have to feel this way. This is business, and business requires agreements. I'm just offering you a way out, something that benefits us both. Think about your husband. Do you want him to endure the humiliation of being evicted?" His words were like poison, slowly sliding into my mind. Every sentence was designed to manipulate me, to make me feel like I had no other choice. I hated myself for not being able to tell him to leave, for not having the courage to confront him. But more than anything, I hated myself for the doubts that were beginning to form inside me. Finally, Don Samuel stood up and moved toward me. I took a step back, but he extended his hand, trying to close the distance between us with an attitude that put me on alert. His tone shifted, becoming more persuasive, almost seductive. "Luisa, it doesn't have to be complicated," he said, leaning slightly toward me. "Just think of this as a favor. You and I can make this discreet, without anyone knowing." I didn't respond. My body was frozen, my mind torn between guilt and desperation. I could feel him trying to force a closeness I didn't want, and my body froze. "Think about your husband, about keeping your home intact," he whispered. I closed my eyes and felt his presence enveloping me, pulling me towards something I knew I could never undo. The first time was a storm of conflicting lessons. Disgust, guilt, the feeling of crossing a line I never imagined, but also the temporary relief of thinking I had bought time to prevent my world from collapsing. When it was over, I was left alone in the apartment, with the echo of his voice resonating in my mind. I knew this was just the beginning, and that each encounter would serve as a reminder of the line I had crossed to protect my family. Weeks passed like a slow sigh, filled with furtive encounters and sleepless nights. Don Samuel had turned my life into a web of lies and secrets that suffocated me more each day. Every time he knocked on the door, my heart shrank with terror and disgust, but also resignation. I couldn't afford to fail. The apartment, my marriage, everything depended on me keeping up the act. But Angel began to suspect. One night while we were having dinner in silence, he placed his fork on the plate and looked at me with an expression I had never seen in his eyes before. "Luisa, is there something you're not telling me?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of concern and doubt. I quickly shook my head, avoiding his gaze. "Of course not, Angel. I'm just tired. It's been a long day." He nodded, but his expression didn't change. I knew my husband wasn't naive, and eventually, the pieces would start to fall into place. Everything exploded one Wednesday afternoon. Angel had come home early from his new job, excited to tell me that he had received an unexpected bonus. I hadn't been expecting it, especially not at that hour. Don Samuel had arrived just a few minutes earlier, insisting on his usual monthly conversation. I was handing him his payment in the living room when Angel opened the door. The silence that followed was deafening. Angel's smile instantly faded and his gaze moved between us, searching for answers neither of us was willing to give. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. I tried to speak, but the words got stuck in my throat. It was Don Samuel who broke the silence with his disgusting calmness that made me want to scream. "We were just talking about the rent, kid. Don't get paranoid." But Angel wasn't naive. He took a step toward him, his fists clenched and his eyes filled with rage. "Get out of my house right now," he shouted, pointing toward the door. Don Samuel raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, but he couldn't resist dropping one last venomous phrase. "Calm down, kid. Don't stress too much. Maybe you should ask your wife why she lets me in." When he left, Angel turned toward me. His expression was a mix of disbelief and pain. "Luisa, tell me this isn't true. Please, tell me it's not." Tears began to fall down my face. Before I could respond, I tried to explain, to tell him how it all started, but every word that came out of my mouth seemed to make things worse. "How could you?" he shouted, slamming his fist on the table with such force that I thought it would break. "I trusted you, Luisa. I did all of this for us." His pain was like a knife stabbing me again and again. I knew I had destroyed something that I could never repair. But then something unexpected happened. Don Samuel returned, this time accompanied by two men who looked like they had stepped out of a mafia movie. They entered without asking, and the tension in the air became unbearable. "I think our conversation isn't over yet," Don Samuel said, his voice darker than ever. Angel tried to confront him, but one of the men stopped him with a shove that made him stagger back. I screamed, but no one listened. "Luisa, dear, I think you have something to say to your husband, or rather to me if you don't want this to get ugly." In that moment, something inside me broke. I knew I couldn't let this continue. I looked at Angel, who was standing, wounded but resolute, and made a decision. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and stood in front of Don Samuel. "This ends here!" I yelled with a strength I didn't know I had. The men stopped, shocked by my action. Don Samuel took a step back, raising his hands. "Calm down, woman. There's no need to—" "Shut up. I've had enough of your threats." The only thing I remember after that was the sound of sirens. The neighbors, alarmed by the screams, had called the police. Don Samuel and his men were arrested, and I collapsed in Angel's arms. Our marriage was never the same again, but we managed to survive. And although the pain and guilt still haunt me, I also carry the certainty that I will never allow anyone to corner me like that again. Did today's story surprise you? Then you won't want to miss what's coming next. Like it if it left you intrigued, and subscribe to continue exploring the most shocking secrets. Click on the next video and stay on the edge of your seat with us.